Welcome back. 1 week from today will mark 25 years since the signing of the Oslo Accords. The moment captured in this now infamous photo when then Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat signed an agreement outlining a time frame for lasting Middle Eastern peace. A quarter of a century on, many are left wondering about what could have been after the agreement, which promised an end to a decades-long conflict, all but failed. As the US promises it will soon release its plan for peace, one the Palestinians say is not being brokered fairly, and Egypt and the UN trying to hash out a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Gaza's rulers Hamas, the landscape is far from what it was back in 1993. Now, Dolev Singer was a legal advisor to the official Israeli delegation in the contact on the peace process, and he was the one who actually drafted the Oslo Accords. He also represented the Israeli army in Prime Minister Menachem Begin's Camp David Accords, and he joins me now from Washington, D.C. Mr. Singer, a pleasure to speak with you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very good. Now, I'm going to flip this interview on its head. I want to start by looking how the region has in fact been served by the foundation that was built from the Oslo Agreement. How does the region continue to benefit from that template?
Well, I know that some people, a lot of people are hoping that with a lot of pressure, the two parties can be pushed into signing a grand settlement agreement, a peace agreement that will resolve once and for all the issues. I don't believe it's going to happen any soon now. It may take many more years to happen. And the best that the two sides and the rest of the world can do at this time is be very careful to ensure that the foundations established in Oslo do not collapse, and that the parties build upon them progressively, constantly, more layers, because I don't believe that this existential dispute can be resolved in one fell swoop.
All right, so perhaps some advice there to Trump's peace team, who has vowed to release its peace plan. Now, with a quarter of a century of hindsight now, what went wrong with the Oslo Accords? What should be learned from this?
Well, if you ask the critics of Oslo Agreement, they can give you a long list of things that went wrong, and some would say that Oslo was dead from birth, and that Oslo should not have been negotiated at all. I do not believe that Oslo was an error in and of itself. I can probably tell more than others what went wrong, because I was there sitting between Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres from the very beginning, and observing them making the historic decisions. One error that they made, which I think was cardinal, is to refuse to accept the Palestinian demand that settlement activity would be freezed during the 5-year transitional period. At that time, they thought that this is just a 5-year period. Let's wait until the permanent status agreement, just a few years down the road, and let's deal with the settlements then. And meanwhile, let's not bother with freezing the settlement activity, because we will evacuate most settlers ultimately, but let's not do it now. No one then predicted it would take 25 years and still counting, that Rabin would be assassinated, that the Labour Party that was then leading the Israeli government and wished to reach a two-state solution would be replaced by another government that does not put this as one of its highest priorities, and that the number of settlers in the West Bank alone, not excluding Jerusalem, would increase from approximately 100,000 settlers in 1993 to more than 400 settlers. So I think that this is a main error, because it may all but prevent the two-state solution from coming to fruition.
Sure. How much responsibility?
It's a main error.
How much responsibility then does Yasser Arafat hold for the agreement's failure in the initial stages of implementation, when part of the Palestinians' agreement was to crack down on terrorism and incitement and to educate for peace? And of course, we saw the opposite happen.
I would like to look at this from the Israeli point of view. And with your permission, I will address your focus on terrorism from the Israeli point of view, not from the Palestinian point of view. So another error made, in my view, in Oslo was that Rabin and Peres were misled to believe that Arafat was then a capable and willing partner to make peace with. They saw him, they had observed him for years being able to foil any attempt by anyone else, anyone who is not Yasser Arafat, to make peace with Israel regarding the West Bank and Gaza fate. And he again and again foiled them. Those attempts, the Jordanian option, the Egyptian attempt to represent the Palestinian cause in the Menachem Begin Camp David Agreement of 1978, and other attempts by Israel to negotiate the fate of the West Bank with someone other than the PLO. So they thought, well, if Arafat is so strong to prevent anyone else from making peace with Israel,
right,
he must be the only one with whom we can make peace. And that was an error, because ultimately Arafat proved himself to be, at a minimum, not capable of fighting the Hamas and other terrorist organization, and many Israelis would say not even willing to do so.
Right.
So that was an error on the Israeli part.
And now, on that point, as the number of those terror attacks peaked in the wake of Oslo, even left-wingers, those who were filled with hope by Oslo, they abandoned their post. Now, the trust in Palestinian leadership in curbing terror or even wanting peace was then broken. Can that ever be undone?
Excuse me, can you repeat the question? I'm sitting here far away.
Sure. The trust in the Palestinian leadership in curbing terror or even wanting peace, it was broken in the days after the Oslo Accord was signed. Can that ever be undone, that breach of trust or the lack of trust?
Well, there are two issues here. One issue was, and they are closely related, so I'll try to explain how they differ. One is that in the Oslo agreement, Rabin and Peres agreed to allow the PLO and Yasser Arafat to share responsibility for security in the West Bank and Gaza with Israel. The belief was that Arafat can fight the Hamas, a common enemy to Israel and the PLO, better than Israel. And because they believed he was strong and charismatic enough among the Palestinians, that he can better do that than Israel could. He didn't. He let the Hamas kill Israelis and was not able, and I would dare say not entirely willing, to fight the Hamas. Because, as it turned out, when Israel left the Gaza later, Hamas took over Gaza from the PLO. They managed to kill all the PLO operatives in Gaza, very quickly got rid of them. So if the PLO was not capable of defending its own people, how could the PLO have defended Israelis against Hamas? And Rabin and Peres erred in that regard.
Right.
So that is one aspect. Now, this has been rectified. After the second Intifada broke, the IDF reinvaded the West Bank, took over, and the IDF is there to take care of security. How can the IDF now get out again under a final peace agreement is something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully.
Certainly.
Because the last thing that Israel or the PLO would want is Israel to go out. The Hamas will take over the West Bank as it did in Gaza, and then Israel will have to reinvade the West Bank. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that you need a really strong leader on the Palestinian side to be able to make the sacrifices that are necessary to make peace and enforce his will, his decisions on the opposition. Abu Mazen is not the right person to do that. Even Yasser Arafat was not capable of doing that. So we need to wait for a new leader, a new, strong and charismatic Palestinian leader to emerge.
Just finally, Mr. Singer, you of course lost a dear friend in the wake of this agreement, Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated. How did that event reframe the landscape in your mind?
Well, I saw Yitzhak Rabin as the necessary, strong leader. And let me just explain. In order to make peace, you need strong leaders on both sides. And in 1993, I saw just that. On the Israeli side, there was Mr. Security, Yitzhak Rabin, with Shimon Peres next to him. They didn't like one another, but they complemented one another. Shimon Peres with his long vision, Yitzhak Rabin with his attention to detail and his leadership and charisma. So on the Israeli side, that was like a one-time opportunity. And on the Palestinian side, Yasser Arafat, a long-standing Palestinian leader, the only Palestinian leader. So the feeling was, here is a historic opportunity where you suddenly have strong leadership on both sides. And what happened? Rabin was assassinated, and I loved him, and I appreciated, I admired him as a prime minister, and I thought he was the right kind of a leader to make it happen. And on the PLO side, Yasser Arafat proved to be not capable, unwilling, so we lost this golden opportunity, and we need to wait until a new opportunity arises.
Mr. Singer, we really appreciate. Right.
And I want to.
Well, I unfortunately have to cut you off there because we have to go out for a break here on Perspectives. We'll be looking at the Oslo Accords in depth in 1 week's time. Appreciate that, Mr. Singer. On September 13th, we'll be looking at that 25 years on. A lot more.